examine my faith. I am open to examination of my faith. As a Christian, if you talk to anyone who's been in any seminars that I've done, any teaching that I've done, they will tell you that that is a big thing that I harp on, is that Christians should examine their faith, should examine why it is true. Faith in Christianity is not a denial of truth. Faith is an acceptance of the truth that God has revealed, the truth that we see in the world around us, and it goes beyond simply the truth to provide a framework upon which we can live our lives.
But see, this is the whole thing, is that Christianity is basically a lie. There is no historical evidence that Jesus ever existed. There's no historical evidence that the New Testament is anything but a set of extant writings that were around from about, maybe 100 or 150 years before the alleged time of Jesus, that were simply gathered up later and became the basis for the Roman Catholic theology in 325 A.D.
Let me mention something to you, especially at that point. What I wanted to bring out was this common atheistic claim that Jesus never existed. And the reason I want to bring it up, aside from discussing the historical evidence he did, since there is a vast amount of it, this sort of is a religious belief. It really is, because anyone who has examined the historical documents has to come to the conclusion that there's a large amount of evidence that Jesus did exist. And so for as many atheists as I have heard say this, to believe this, it's almost like it's become a cult belief amongst atheists that Jesus never existed, and this is in spite of the vast amount of evidence that he did. And this is the kind of situation where you have a belief system overriding the critical examination of historical facts, and this is where you have a similarity, at least in a way, to how some religious systems operate. And that's interesting to me that this would come up, and I expected it did. In reference, Brian, if you'd like to expand on what you said concerning that, if you'd like to say something more about that, I'd like to before I get to the evidence in reference to that.
Okay, the criteria for evidence is something which is really not subject to dispute. In other words, do you have artifacts that were actually written by Jesus? Do you have an artifact like a body, for example, that you can say, well, this is Jesus' tomb, or this is Jesus' body, or this is Jesus' remains? The other criteria would be human experience and things which can be validated and corroborated, and none of this applies to Jesus.
Okay, I'd like to respond to that by saying that if what you said is true, that is indisputable, then we do not know that Julius Caesar, Plato, Socrates, or anyone up until about 25 years ago ever existed.
False, because we do have material evidence that these people left. We do have...
Such as what, sir?
We have their tombs. We have the evidence that was left from what they did with their soldiers. If in the case of the Caesars, we have the writings of Plato. They are absolutely, definitely attributed to these people.
Exactly.
However, there is not one piece of paper that we can attribute to Jesus.
Okay.
There is nothing that Jesus ever wrote. There is nothing that anybody can demonstrate was actually taken down by even a scrivener who knew Jesus.
Well, that's obviously untrue. Let me mention a number of the facts aside from the New Testament. I'll get to that in a moment. For example, Tacitus, who died in 117, mentions Jesus Christ. Suetonius mentioned rebellion in Rome in AD 49, which he attributed to Christ, even though obviously Christ was not alive at that time. A pagan philosopher by the name of Mara, I was reading his letter just yesterday, in fact, in AD 74, discussed Jesus Christ. And it's interesting that there are references to Christ in, for example, Pliny's writings and things like that, because these events took place in what was a fairly insignificant corner of the Roman Empire. And for them to actually gain mention by Roman historians, by philosophers writing at the time, and those manuscripts be extant still today, is very interesting that could happen.
Yes, but let's look at the actual content of those manuscripts. What they really talk about is they talk about cults of believers. They talk about people who have a faith in a great leader, and in some cases, I'm not sure if it was Mara or if it was Suetonius, they mention the followers of the teachers of righteousness, and that man was a man who lived about 100 to 150 years before the alleged time of Christ, and he was the leader of the cult known as the Essenes, which were a strange proselytizing sect of Jews.
Yes, so Brian is making reference to the teacher of righteousness found in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
That's right.
The Essene community at Qumran, of course, that is not what Mara had in reference whatsoever.
No. What he's talking
Sir,
about is a body of believers.
No,
and
sir. Did you read the letter, Brian?
I don't know if I've read the specific letter you're referring to, but I have read some of his writings, and I know for a fact that they are not referring to an actual living, breathing person named Jesus.
Well, let me
there is
just
the writings of
challenge the
Josephus,
listeners,
which are often cited. These are known to be an interpolation and a forgery. Josephus never wrote them.
Let me mention something, Brian.
And this is something that we see over and over again in Christian scholarship, is that it is all based on fabrication. It is based on misrepresentation. It is based on deliberately taking things out of context and trying to piece them together to establish something which is false.
Again, let me point out that I've read the letter. I have the letter. You can look at it yourself, and you'll see that Brian's wrong. You don't have to take my word for it. I don't want anyone to take my word for it. Check it out yourself. Don't take Brian's word for anything. Don't take my word for anything.
Don't take my word for anything. Check these things out,
exactly.
and you will find that there is no evidence for Jesus.
Okay, then we go on from the fact that he is mentioned by numerous writers, such as these Roman historians and philosophers that I was mentioning, and you can check them out for yourself, to the existence of the New Testament. Now, Brian had made the charge the New Testament was nothing more than a compilation of documents that might have been written. I hope I misunderstood you. You said possibly 100 years before Christ?
Many of them were written 100 to 150 years before Christ, and some of them were written as late as 150 to 200 years after Christ.
I see. Now, let me ask you, Brian, do you know anything about the subject of textual criticism?
Yes.
Do you know anything about the Byzantine manuscript tradition, Alexandrian, anything like that?
Yeah, let me go on with something here, because I think we're on to something important.
Well,
you're wasting time. You're wasting valuable airtime asking me a bunch of useless rhetorical questions. What we're talking about here is we're talking about sets of documents that were used by bodies of believers who believed that they were the inspired word of a deity. And it was common in those days for these believers to think that, well, every word, every letter, every sentence, everything was inspired by a deity. Therefore, it must be correct to take these and recombine them in any form to establish any proposition. This was something that was common in all of these little cults of believers. They were known as the Christiani, the Christus cults, or whatever, throughout the Roman Empire. And it was very common for them to take a piece of this document, a piece of that document, and simply invent their own gospel or their own book of Acts, their own letters, whatever you want to call them. And these were gathered up in about, 250 A.D. by Eusebius, who's decided to pronounce certain of these the absolute true word of the deity, and his proclamation created a lot of tension, a lot of bitterness, a lot of hatred, a lot of animosity in the early church, and finally in 325 A.D., Constantine saw it would be politically useful to him as a ruler to gather all these leaders together and say, well, let's all agree that we're going to have, certain books that we're going to use in our theology and certain things that we're going to teach these people. And that's basically what the Council of Nicaea was all about. Finally, over periods of hundreds of years, various books were voted in and out of the Bible, and the King James Bible, which most Protestants in this country are familiar with, or the Douay version, which many Catholics are familiar with, were not actually declared canonical until about the 1600s, and that was by a vote. They simply took a vote in the Church of England. This is what the King James Bible is. It is something that was simply decided by a ballot. A bunch of people who were religious leaders got together and said, okay, let's vote on which books we want to include. And they said, do you want this one? Yes, no. If they said yes, it was included. If they said no, it was thrown out. It was simply a matter of vote.
If I tried to enumerate the number of historical errors in what we just heard, it would take me the rest of the afternoon. It's absolutely amazing. Let me point a few things out. A, there is not one shred of evidence that any New Testament document existed before the lives of the writers